Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Learning Measurement 2021, with David Wentworth, Principal HCM Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and Mike Martin, Head of Customer Experience and Training at SAP Litmos. Mike is a seasoned leader in the L&D space who has spent his professional career helping customers and employees increase their success through training and learning. In his current role, Mike leads SAP Litmos mentoring and onboarding, account management, and customer training. His innovative and energetic style has helped to create a seamless, best-in-class experience for all SAP Litmos customers. I would like to extend a thank you to SAP Litmos for sponsoring today's webinar. SAP Litmos is SAP Litmos solutions are the future of rapidly implemented training for the customer-focused enterprise. The solution combines a powerful LMS SAP Litmos training with a robust course library, SAP Litmos training content. It enables targeted learning, boosts employee experience and loyalty, and protects the brand by keeping the organization compliant. By engaging learners right in the flow of work, SAP Litmos solutions empower personnel with knowledge that drives a better customer experience, improving KPIs across the enterprise. SAP Litmos has achieved Brandon Hall Group's Smart Choice Preferred Provider status. I wanted to also share a little bit about Brandon Hall Group. Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Our vision is to inspire a better workplace experience. We have world-class research, data, and expertise across all areas in human capital management. And Dave, I don't think the slides are advancing. Currently, we have open survey and learning strategy, as well as employee engagement, people analytics, and leadership development. A link will be placed in the chat box for the Learning Strategy survey, and you can also click on the links to take any of the surveys when you download the handout. In return, you will receive a summary report of the research results once the survey is completed and results analyzed, as well as free research instantly. You could also receive a free gift card as well. And finally, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. The playback will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by typing into the questions box for our presenters. If you'd like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. And now let's turn it over to David so we can get started.
Great, thanks, Danny, and welcome everybody. And I would just encourage folks to use that question box if you have any questions for Mike or myself. We will be keeping track of that as we go along and answer any relevant questions as they come in. We'll also try to save a little time at the end to catch up with any we may have missed. So please use that. That's how you're going to communicate with us today. So even if you don't have a question, if you just have something you'd like to add, you can put it in there and we'll be able to see that. So take advantage of that as well as the download of the slides. So Mike and I are here today to talk about learning measurement and sort of looking ahead to 2021 and obviously the year to come and where organizations maybe need to go and things we need to think about as we move forward when it comes to measuring our learning efforts. But before we can sort of leap forward, we sort of need to take a look and see where things currently stand so we understand what the journey might look like, what it's going to entail, what things we need to consider in order to broaden our view of what learning measurement really is. So currently, we're not doing the best job, apparently. Brandon Hall Group, we've been doing this research for many years, and we've only seen incremental improvement over the years when we ask organizations about their learning measurement. But we see here almost 70% of companies say that the inability to measure learning's impact is a huge challenge to actually achieving the learning outcomes. Right? So we all know that the reason why learning exists is we're trying to achieve some sort of outcome, whatever that may be. But the fact that we can't measure how well we're doing that means that there's a good chance we may not be achieving those outcomes. And so, measurement isn't just about looking backwards and seeing how well we did. It's a very intertwined relationship where a focus on measurement is actually going to help learning have an impact, and we'll get into that. And we have a model that we'll talk through and look at how that actually works. So when we do this research, we take a look at organizations and how they're approaching learning, and we look across the whole spectrum and break it down into what we have here is our maturity model, and say, okay, where are people with their learning measurement approaches? And it's pretty heavily weighted near the bottom, the ones and the twos of where organizations are. a lot of basic measurement, a lot of smile sheets, a lot of learner completions and test scores, things like that. And then as you move up the maturity curve, you start to see more and different types of metrics coming in, things that move beyond just the completion of learning, the actual changes in behaviors. We actually start to see organizations pulling data from around the organization and seeing how much that is changing in relation to the learning programs that they're putting out there. And you know, very few organizations up there at that level, for less than 10%, who are doing the full gamut of data collection and analysis and getting into things like predictive analytics and so forth when it comes to measurement, which, you know, clearly that's a heady promise up there to get to that level. But as you get there, that clear line of sight comes into focus between learning and what's happening in the business. And we hear time and time again that organizations or learning leaders say, well, I can't really show that learning has had an impact on that particular outcome because there's too many other variables involved, and so, you know, there's no point in me measuring it. And, you know, at this point, Mike, I was going to ask you, you know, I think you hear some of the same things I do when we talk to organizations, and you talk to your clients and your prospects and try to help them through this stuff. But is that the similar story, or do you hear some other reasons why it's a difficult ladder to climb here?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody out there. I definitely hear the same stuff, and it's not surprising to me. I think that it comes down to time, is what I hear from our customers and from people in my world, is that there just isn't the time or the focus on it, right? So it says we just have to get the business done. We need to keep doing the work and make sure that they've at least had something, and we can check it off the list. And in that checkbox culture is what I see a lot of. And really digging in and getting to those top levels, the 3s, the 4s on this measurement maturity model, is really difficult when you don't have that buy-in and you don't have the time. So these are the challenges that I see day to day.
Yeah. And then you can see here off to the left that only 27% of companies say that their learning strategy, right? We went and looked into our learning strategy study, that the overarching learning strategy, only just around a quarter of companies say that that includes a framework to measure the success of the strategy. So that's, if you think about that, all the time and effort that gets put into developing the learning strategy and what it's after and what it's trying to achieve, and the fact that there isn't a methodology in place to figure out if that's actually happening. So yeah. And actually, we already have our first question, which I'm going to go ahead and ask at this point because it's about what we're looking at here. But Chris was asking, you know, about specific tools. You know, are there specific tools that can help get to level 4? Like, are there ways to capture this that you recommend, like an LXP or something like that? And, you know, obviously, you know, Mike, you've got a little bit of a stake in the game here, but I think we can say things like a tool like SAP Litmos and others that are focused on this, and this is how they, you know, and I've seen it in their work, the way they work with their clients is, you know, there's a big focus on outcomes and getting to that point and using and leveraging the tools. And you'll see later in some of the research that that's a big piece of it is, you know, Mike, you said it comes down to companies saying they don't have the time. You know, that goes hand in hand with the lack of technology or understanding the technology it takes to actually pull all this stuff together. But, you know, you see that because you guys solve for that.
Yep. Exactly. I think a lot of it too comes down to just many learning organizations within the companies are very small, right? 1, 2, 3 people. I had 5 when I worked for a company before this, before I joined Litmos, and that was a lot, I thought, right? So I mean, it was pretty interesting to have that, but most of the time we're small, so we have to deal with what we have within the timeframes that are allowed. And so being able to have the technology like an SAP Litmos to be at the center of the learning strategy for us, at least to give us the visibility, was really what it was for me. Like when I joined that business, Build.com was the business I joined. I was only one person at the time to set up the entire training department, and I tried to do exactly what the caller was talking about now. You know, was to figure out what could I use to help me center it, and what technology could help buy some of my time back for some of the other in-person and things that I needed to do. So I started looking for things like that, like an LMS, like things to create one-to-many training and those types of things. So great question.
Yeah, and you know, that's part of it. We think about, when you go back to thinking about the learning strategy, we always talk to our companies we work with and say, well, once you've gotten there, you have to figure out what the technology ecosystem is that's going to help you execute on that strategy, right? You can't just simply create a strategy and set it off into the wild. You need the
Yep.
tools that are actually going to execute, and the measurement is part of that, right?
Support
So
you.
you create that measurement framework. Okay, how do you plan on doing that? And it's not going to be paper and pencil. And we'll get into this a little more too, but we've both had experience talking to companies that have done it relatively manually, Excel spreadsheets, things like that, and how difficult that can really be. So technology always plays a role in executing on the strategy, but it's really about putting the strategy and the framework in place to start, and then having the right technology to execute. So looking in a little bit deeper into those companies that said, said that they didn't have a framework to measure success, we took a little deeper and we looked at what we call high performing organizations. The shorthand there is HIPOs on your screen, which is the light blue, the 40%, and then compared to everybody else. And those high performing organizations in our research are companies whose key performance indicators for the organization are positive and growing year over year versus others. And so all of a sudden you see this disparity, right? It went from 27% overall to 40% of high performers say that they have a framework to measure success, and only 18% of everybody else does. Now, that's obviously not the reason that they're high performers, but there is a bit of a correlation there that says high performers are more likely to think like this and to have this in place. Still 40%, a lot of room for improvement, but you can see the difference between the two types of companies. All right, so what I want to walk through right now, and this is these are the results of a study that we did together, SAP Litmos and Brandon Hall Group. And so we've got some of the results to share with you, and it starts to paint a picture of where things are and where they may be headed. And it also highlights some areas where we can sort of dig in and think about improving things. So we asked organizations, okay, what's L&D's role in setting actual business objectives, right? And this is an interesting question to me because it's usually asked the other way around about, what role does the business have in setting learnings outcomes or metrics, right? And that's a key piece. But even, it's more interesting to me is this: is L&D playing a role in those overall business objectives? And you could understand that in many cases that wouldn't be happening. Learning maybe doesn't have as much of a strategic role in some organizations. So you see here about 12% say that L&D is strongly involved. Another 24% rank themselves as a 4 on that scale. But if you look at this curve, it's actually not too bad. I honestly, when we originally looked at the question, I would have expected the curve to be a little bit closer to the front, with fewer of these things happening. And so, Mike, maybe you can talk about this a little bit. And even in your own practical experience, did you have any experience working with setting business objectives?
It's an uphill battle. I think some of the folks in my L&D world can relate to this. That typically the business sets the objectives to for profit gain, whatever it might be, whatever those things are, and then it looks to L&D as kind of an ancillary thing to say, how can you help support us to get us there? Or you'll have it come down from the top and say, just train these people, just get them up to speed, right? And there isn't a lot of thought in that. So it's interesting to see this graph and see that there's hope, right? That there are more folks that are saying that they're a big part of that, which again is a fantastic thing if you can get there, if you can get that executive buy-in and get folks to understand that really the only way that you get there to meet the things you want to meet and to increase your profits, your revenues, your customer satisfaction, whatever it might be, is to get your people to be better, stronger, faster, those types of things. And that comes down to training them, right? Comes down to giving them something that's going to make them better at what they do and add more value to the business. So it's very exciting to me to see that this at least gives a glimmer of hope that that's happening more than what I've traditionally seen in the past.
Yeah, and this also hints at something else, which is the other direction of this, which means there's a great opportunity for L&D to have those conversations with the business about metrics and outcomes and how to measure and getting access to the data that proves that L&D is having an impact on these objectives. So it's a good sign for that strategic relationship that's required for a lot of this to work. As we get a little bit closer to the people side of things, moving down from, say, the organizational outcomes, and we look at talent requirements, obviously L&D plays an even stronger role here in identifying what the organization needs from a talent perspective. When this is, and again, this is a great sign, because I think, in the past, learning was seen as the tool to fix or meet the talent requirements. Not exactly part of the identification process, just that happens somewhere else, and then they knock
Throw
on learning's
training
door
at
and
it,
say,
right?
yeah, so we need
That's
this.
what I hear all the time.
Right. And then on the other end of that spectrum is organizations feeling like they're going to hire their way out of talent needs. Right. They'll look at themselves internally and say, okay, here are our talent requirements. We're going to have to go hire all these folks. When there's a good chance it's cheaper and quicker to find the right people and just upskill or reskill them enough to get them where they want to be or need to be. So again, having L&D play a stronger role in actually identifying the requirements and not just reacting to them, I think is a key part of getting learning closer to the impact of the business. And again, this all comes back to measurement. By being part of this process, it bakes the measurement into the learning because it's already started at this level.
Mm-hmm. I think too, just another thought on both of these last two is that, you know, I've always been told you have to ask for what you need, right? And I don't know how many times that, you know, having conversations with folks in L&D that it's like I've asked them, said, have you gone to the directors, the managers, the executives, and pitched them on this, right? To say, hey, here's what I'm thinking, and here's what the benefit would be, and to be able to have that conversation and say, if we're brought in earlier, here's the result, and speak in their language, right? Here's the result on that investment. And I think some people just haven't had that conversation, like they haven't felt empowered to. Well, no, I actually haven't had that conversation to go and tell them. I've just reacted to what they tell me. And so I think that's some good advice out there too, is just to think about it and see how much have you gone and been proactive with this stuff to say, if we're involved earlier, here's what you can get out of that.
Right. And what are the chances that your business leaders don't want to hear that, right? That
Exactly.
don't want that help.
And it's a no until you ask, right? I mean, you got to know now. It's like you might as well go and ask and have those conversations and keep asking until they hear you. I think it's an important piece of it. We need to be advocates and salespeople for our own products.
Yes. And so this next one here to me is impressive because in the past this has been really not this not this well curved to the high end, the 4s and the 5s. So we've seen that organizations have struggled with this, linking L&D's objectives to the business objectives. But here in this most recent study, not too bad. I mean, 19% up there that's strongly linked, which is obviously far better than the 4% down at not at all. In the history of our research on learning measurement, we've seen a lot of organizations struggling with the fact that learning just isn't aligned, which always kind of boggled my mind when I would hear that or see that as a survey result. And so I was, well, then what are you doing? Like, what's learning's function in the building then? Is it simply to make sure everyone's taking their compliance training? Because if it's not pushing towards some sort of business objective, then what's it doing? And I would argue that even if it was strictly compliance, there are business objectives baked into that compliance as well. So I don't know, were you surprised by this? Because honestly, this was the one that surprised me the most of how well this seemed to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's great. Again, it's hopeful. I look at that 4% and I think, okay, that's where the consultants go in, right? That's rich with just going in and fixing a few things for them. But it definitely needs to be linked, and it's exciting to see that most people, most organizations who responded to this are showing that linking to say, all right, we're making the case, right? We're making the connection, and I think that's so important when you're talking that language to executives of just, again, at the end of the day, they want to make money or save money. I mean, I think those are the two biggest goals of business, right? I mean, really, if you want to simplify it or oversimplify it, and how is learning doing either of those two things? Or, I mean, it's a learning and development when it's helping with those things, when it's linked to the objectives. It's a cover your butt organization or a cover your butt function of the business if it's not, right? That's just more what you were talking about, David, of we check the boxes and legal says they've had this course and now we can't be sued at least, or they can, but they won't get far, right? Because we have, and to me, it's so much more than that, and getting out of that frame of mind is difficult, but this gives me hope.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then if we get a little more granular, right, we step down from the big L&D objectives and we look at the individual learners and we look at their individual development plans, and are those linked to business objectives? And again, a decent curve up near the top here, maybe not as strong as the overall, business objectives, but again, this goes beyond just even the measurement piece, right? The idea of, okay, if these development plans are linked to objectives, I can measure their effectiveness, how well they're working based on the, whether those objectives are being met. But this also has a lot to do with learner engagement and there's all this stuff about relevancy and impact to the learner themselves, because in this individual development plan, whatever that looks like in your organization, and trust me, it's different everywhere you go, but if you're able to demonstrate, look, here's your development plan, and here's how that lines up with what we as an organization are trying to do, and you'd be surprised how often that doesn't happen. And if it's there, the learner now has, okay, I get it. I understand why I'm being presented with this particular piece of learning, whatever it is, if it's a 2-day class or a 20-minute video or a 5-minute activity, whatever it is. If I understand where that thing lives in relation to what I'm doing and what the business is trying to do, it makes a lot more sense. It's more relevant. I'm sort of inherently engaged in it because I've made that connection. So this is a real critical piece. And this is a difficult one. And is this something, Mike, and I don't know the answer to this question, is this something that you and your organization, do you work through this sometimes with clients, like helping them figure out how to do this?
Not a ton. I mean, we definitely give them best practices and hope that, when we're looking at the tool that we offer to the public with the LMS and the content and such, yes. Well, when we're going through the mentor process and linking them to that and getting them all set up, we're talking about these things. We're not going super in depth, but we're definitely trying to get them to understand that through different course paths or different collections of content that they can offer at certain times, that it's all about setting their learners up for success. And I think to touch base on something that you said a second ago, I mean, relevance. If you want to engage an adult learner, relevance is the #1 thing in my book. And I'm just going to stand on my own soapbox there and say that, is that, again, I think you said it best there, David, is like, look, if I don't know why I'm doing this, then chances of me being connected and excited about it, or thinking of it as anything more than just I have to do this type thing and get it done, are very, very slim. But the minute that I can connect it back to business objectives, or I see the what's in it for me behind that, then it becomes a lot more palatable, and then it becomes something that adult learners will want to engage in. We know that from studies, from research, that they need to have it needs to be relevant. And I think one of the biggest things there is because, again, going back to time being our greatest asset, our greatest resource, and the one thing that we all have the exact same amount of, right? And so when you're talking about that, it's like I can either do the work, or I can learn about doing the work to get better at doing the work, right? And a lot of times those things are fighting each other, when it's like, well, I'm just going to get in and I don't have time for that, even though spending the time working on the business will help everybody else in the business as well.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of all of these challenges, not even just learning measurement, but any of them, is that to be really good, or to get any movement on any of these things, these aspirational things that learning is looking at, it's going to take a little bit of work up front. And that's always been a challenge. But once and once that front end work is done, though, then that's when the payoff rolls in, and then it's a little bit more autonomous after that. But it's just getting over that initial hump of, we've only done it this way. It's going to take a lot of work to do it another way. It's just finding the wherewithal to do that work.
Well, that shows a greater maturity too, David. I mean, if you think about it, right? Most people are reactive. They're in the moment. They want whatever feels good or is gonna solve whatever problems in front of them. But this is much more mature when you're looking at it and saying, okay, I know it's going to spend some time up front to get this done and resources, but here's what's going to happen as a result once the structure and the environment is set up for people to succeed in.
Yep. Yeah, and before we dive deeper into some of the ROI pieces of this, there were a few things that came in that I wanted to touch on. And Chris, it seems more like a rhetorical question, but I think it's something we can talk about. It was, we were talking about the connection to the business and being involved in setting outcomes and so forth. And so Chris was saying, this has me asking how we're enabling L&D to partner with talent management and the business for both recruiting and high potential determination, like determining who's high pods. And I think that's a big piece. That's all of this stuff is really about those partnerships. It isn't just, it's a partnership with the business to find out what the business needs and what the outcomes are and what quote unquote good looks like, as well as partnering with the larger talent management community, whether, some organizations it's separate, some it's all in the same, that fluctuates as you go from one company to the next. But the idea that, understanding with learning, so that the hiring decisions that are being made smarter. We're not just putting recs out there for stuff that, you've got somebody in-house who's 94% of the way there. How do we know that, and do we have some of that information as part of our learning data? Can we share between the two systems and the two functions so we can get a better idea of what we've got? And that actually gets into a question that was asked about how do you go about identifying the skills gaps that exist within an organization. I don't know if you wanted to give some thoughts on identifying skills gaps.
I think there has to be like a book way, like a book smart academic way of doing it, and also an in-person style or Zoom in this brave new world that we have here, right? Some sort of behavioral way too. Like I think training does a great job of presenting skills and things. I mean, like, okay, on paper I know that, but then when I go out into practice, it's something completely different. And that's why we have that's why live training is so great for so much stuff, right? Because you get the immediate feedback, and of course we know all of these things as L&D professionals. But to identify those gaps, we have to be able to do both of those, and you have to be able to track it and have to have a way to make sense of it. And that's why I think something like the SAP Litmos solution, an LMS of any kind, I mean, really just to bring it up a level, being able to have all of that data in one place where you're saying, okay, we know that we know they know it from a book smart standpoint, academic standpoint. Now we can actually videotape them and have people go through it. Like, let's say it's a sales call or something like that, and you want to know what their greetings like when they answer the phone, a customer service, something to that effect. You can actually have them record it and have AI go through and look for keywords and then give them a score. And I mean, there's a lot of like, these are all things that our product can do. But I mean, the idea is that whatever product you use is being able to bring that stuff together, whether it's academic and live, and have all that data in front of you to be able to look at the learner in like a 360 way and say, okay, now I know you know it. Now I know I've seen you actually do it, the behavior's there. Then we can start seeing, okay, where are the gaps and what do we need to do to help you get there if you're not already?
Yeah, absolutely. So changing gears just a little bit, one of the things we stepped into in this study was just trying to see how organizations were using measurement to figure out the ROI of learning. And I know that's a relatively controversial term, ROI. I think, it's a lot of focus on dollars and cents. And I think some learning professionals kind of lose their minds over whether or not it's something they should be after. But I think the idea is it isn't right about we spent X dollars on learning, so how many X dollars did we save and or earn because of that? I think that's probably the wrong way to look at it. We're just more focused on if you're doing all these other things, right? Lining up with the business, having metrics that matter to the organization, having all that alignment, then by definition, those outcomes are related to those those dollar and cents outcomes. So, but we wanted to find out what organizations are doing when it comes to calculating ROI. And so we asked, do you use these metrics to measure ROI? And the scale was 1 to 5. You can say, 1 was never, 5 was always. And so you can see here things like manager feedback, different assessments, grades and scores, satisfaction rates, completion rates. These are the pretty standard things that we see being used. And again, completion rates are used as a measurement of learning all the time because it's easy and pretty automatic, right? I mean, if somebody launches a program, goes to a class, that's captured in whether they finish it or not. But I've always been challenged by, asking organizations, okay, so you got a 98% completion rate on this program. Tell me how that helps. Like, tell me how the business is affected by that. Because what a completion rate by itself, granted, it's a good piece of data to have in conjunction with other pieces of data, but by itself, that's just assuming then that the learning program was effective and good and pointed in the right direction. So all we have to do is measure whether or not somebody finished it to know that we did our job. And, so when you see this, Mike, and see some of these metrics, I mean, obviously these are the table stakes metrics, but what do you think about how companies are thinking about these when it comes to ROI?
That's a tough one because when you're looking at it, right? I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's about adding value back to the company, and that's how I look at ROI. And it may not be a numerical thing. Eventually, it will. I mean, you have to make that case. I think you need to speak the language of the executive,
Yep.
and always
Yep.
make that case because I think at that level, that's what they're looking at, right? Profits,
Hmm.
losses, where are we putting things? But it's also about, I mean, for us, it's more about that. How are they adding value? How are they making the customers more excited about the product? How are they keeping them from churning? How are they getting them pumped to buy more from the business, right? These are also the things that we need to be looking at. And yeah, I think we all fall into the trap. I know I have. I'm guilty. I'm definitely guilty of it. That just using completion rates and saying, look at all the success we're having because we have a 99% completion rate. But that next step is the one that's most critical. It's like, what do you do with it at the end of the day, right? Like, what's the next thing? And that's where we run out of time. It's like, okay, on to the next thing, right? And right before you get to the really good stuff. So it's a challenge that I face too, and I think a lot of us out there would probably be in the same boat and be empathetic to each other's plights.
Yeah, I would say that is true. So then we moved into some more specifics around ROI. And so if we look over on the left at this pie chart that we've got here, we asked, okay, does learning calculate ROI as it relates to meeting specific business objectives, right? So are you thinking about ROI in terms of are we meeting these objectives or not? And so we saw had a third of companies say, yes, we are doing that, and 67% said no. So those 67% are already, not doing the things that, Michael and I were just talking about. So when we look at that yes portion, those companies that are doing that, we said, okay, then what are they using? And we asked them, what outcomes are you using to calculate that ROI? And again, this is that 1 to 5 scale, never to always. So employee engagement, right? And this is overall employee engagement, not just learner engagement. Are you engaged in this program? Smile sheet sort of thing. This is overall employee engagement, which is a big metric for a lot of organizations. Using that to determine whether or not L&D is supplying some ROI. And you got those customer experience ratings and customer satisfaction scores. I mean, that to me is critical, right? We've done work in the past around the customer experience and how important that is and how it ranks on business priorities, improving that customer experience, improving customer satisfaction. And there's a million books on how, that starts with your people, right? And how do we get people to do these things better is through learning and development. So using those as measurements of ROI of learning are really critical. And you can see the rest as we move down here, things like, effectiveness of leaders. Are we reducing turnover in the organization? Actual revenue growth, that's ranking there in the mid to low 3s. Onboarding time. Again, back to the customers, the net promoter score. Not everyone uses net promoter score in general, but there are companies that are using that as a measurement of learning. So this to me is heartening. And so when those companies in that 33% that say, yeah, we are, tracking whether or not L&D is meeting specific objectives, these are great objectives to see here on this list.
Yeah, I'd also say as an action item here for everyone on the call, I'd say this is a great assessment, like a checklist assessment for you to go down and start to see in your business and in your world, are you doing these things? And what does that mean to you? And to what level and in what extent have you had these conversations with executives? I think this is a great list to start from. Don't try to boil the ocean, as it were, right? But to do them all at the same time. But it's like pick a couple and say, maybe this quarter we're going to focus on customer satisfaction scores. I know, like for us, one of the big pieces on my team is the onboarding experience. We call them mentors, right? So we track all of that through Smartsheet. We have an assessment that goes out after every engagement, and we track that, and we look at each individual person, and then we meet on that and talk about it. And what's interesting is that that we measure and that we talk about becomes important. And then they start looking at that and start healthy competition and being like, oh, what was that about? If they had a low score somewhere and so on. So it becomes one of those things. Just pick one or two and or go down the list and just rate yourself and see where you're at. This seems like a pretty great list to start from.
Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side of that would be costs. So again, we have that 33% using L&D to calculate ROI. I mean, calculating ROI based on business objectives, what costs are they including in that calculation, that ROI? And so here are some of the costs that go into learning that are being factored. The cost per hour for instructor to deliver training, the technology cost per user, all these different costs, opportunity costs because people are taking time out to attend learning or participate or go through a course. So you can see some of the different costs here that are factored in to the learning ROI calculation. And I think some of these are changing, you know, and I like that it's, you know, cost per hour for the designer, right? It's not how much does it cost to create an hour of learning, because more and more learning is not being delivered in hours. It's been being delivered in various different moments in different ways. And so it's more about what's the cost to create any of those. So it's about the hourly cost, not the cost of an hour. And I think that's an interesting sort of flip we've seen over the last year or so. Okay. And so the challenges to overcome. Before we step into this, there are a lot of questions coming in. So, you know, and so let's bring this up. So Suzanne has some sort of observations that we're talking about L&D, about those outcomes being measured. You know, we're assuming that these points would relate to training of hard skills, and pointing out that there's a difference between L&D and training. I mean, yes and no, but the way I look at it is any of the stuff, whether you call it training, whether it's learning and development, you know, building capability within the organization, they're all should be pointed at something, right? There's some reason the organization, as it's moving along and functioning in its environment, wants to do things better, faster, different. And so how do we do that? You can change policies and procedures, and you can reorganize the way the organization operates, but you're also going to need to move people and what they do and upskill and reskill in that sense. So the programs that you're putting together should be all pointed at those things.
Exactly. It's about building competencies and confidence, and I mean, really, it's a capacity to be able to grow. I mean, I think it's all wrapped up together. There has to be something. There isn't a reason that we'll just say, oh, let's build a training there, and then you have to be like a toddler and start saying, well, why and why and why, and eventually you're going to get to a place where you can't answer that question again. You're like, well, it's this thing. And then that's the thing that you're really trying to move towards. And I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah. So some of the questions that are coming in around some of the challenges. So let's get into those and we can look at some of the questions. But to me, this one is very telling. We ask companies, what percentage of your learning programs are based on specific defined metrics? And again, you can look at the difference between what we call high performing organizations versus others. And you can see that, 32% of high performers say most, 9% say all. I have to be honest, I think this is when this went through design, these got switched, because the high performing organizations in our research were doing a lot more of this.
Sure. Disclaimer. Let's put the disclaimer on there.
And we'll fix this in the PDF. But first of all, there's not a lot of it going on overall. There are many programs are being created that are not based on specific defined metrics, and so that you're already hamstrung, right? If there aren't specific defined metrics that the program is based on, what are you going to measure against? There's nothing there, and so the program ends, it's rolled out, people have taken it, and so all we're left with are completions and smile sheets. So it's a big challenge that, again, I think the overarching theme here is what Mike and I are talking about, is it starts at the beginning. We all, these things need to be sort of built in to the learning itself in order to get to a point where we can really measure strategically.
Yeah, and we have to challenge those folks that come to us all the time. Like my colleagues out there, I know you've had this happen, right? Where somebody's come to you and say, we need training on, and then you're like, okay, and then you do it. But it should be that, all right, what are you trying to get out of it, right? Like, at the end of the day, what do you want them to do, think, feel? No, like what's the point, right? And then if we're always
Mhm.
pushing back on that, and again, this is preaching to the choir. I'm sure that it's all duh stuff, right? Like, yeah, duh, Mike. But I feel like we don't do it a lot, right? I see
Mhm.
all the, I really do. I mean, I think that people know this, but they just don't push back. So let's start with the end in mind. Good, good one there. And just like, let's start from the end and work our way backwards and figure out the best way to get into it. And it may not be training at all. It may be a quick reference guide. It may be a quick conversation with the person. It may be something totally different. So, I mean, this starts from that very, very most basic question of, all right, why? What are you trying to accomplish?
And I'm going to apologize again. I think there might be a technical issue as I launched this poll, because I think the poll was built as you can only select one. It's supposed to be a select all, but in that case, as you're taking this poll that I have just launched, please pick the primary thing as you think about it. What would be the biggest challenge that's keeping you from maybe measuring behavior change and impact, right? So maybe you are doing a ton of measurement around learner feedback, you're doing assessments to make sure that the knowledge has been acquired, but maybe those levels 3 and 4 on the Kirkpatrick scale, those behavior changes and impact to the business. If you could pick the maybe number one reason why you're not measuring those, we can talk through that, because obviously for most organizations it would be multiple of these. I think we all struggle with this from time to time, but let's just get a sense of what the big challenge is. We've got about half the folks that have participated, so let's give it a couple seconds more just so we have a good cross section of folks to look at. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and close this. That's pretty good. And let's take a look. And the biggest one is, not really surprising compared to looking at what we've been talking about, Mike, is we don't have the proper metrics. We don't know what it is that we're supposed to measure against when it comes to behaviors and outcomes. So not surprising to me. What do you think?
I agree, because again, it's a sunk cost there to really stop and take a moment and take the time to really figure out what it is that you want to be measuring. And I think at that point, though, it's about copying other people, right? Like, why? I mean, you need to figure it out for your own business, but there are a lot of other people who have done the work already out there. If you Google search it, or some of the stuff on this webinar, for instance, back a few slides, it's like a good starting point. Like, what do these companies that do this well, what are the things that they measure, and does that make sense for my business? Start there, and then use that as a template as you go along. But I see this as, yeah, see that. Do you want to have the time being the second one? Absolutely. I mean, I hear this from colleagues all the time.
Yeah, the time one is big, and like you had brought it up earlier before we even did the poll. And let's just take a look at what our research showed when we asked the same question. And this is, again, in the study, it was a select all, so people could pick multiple. And then you can see the number one thing in that case, when you're allowed to pick more than one item, ends up being we don't have the time or staff, which is what we were talking about. And in fact, this comes in, a question had come in. I just want to find it because it was specifically about this. Yeah, it says, it was more of a statement, but we could talk about it a little bit. It was that in my organization, the main challenge is to measure, I'm sorry, it was a question about how much time, and that's the biggest challenge that they face. Here we go. By the time you get to the measurement, the business or the learning has moved on.
Yep.
So being timely is crucial. Any thoughts? So for me, my first blush on that is, if you think about the way Mike and I are talking about this, and I'm gonna share the model that sort of gets into this in a minute, but baking it in up front, starting with this can help shrink that tail a little bit from a measurement, right? You don't have to put all of that work in after the fact to figure out what to measure and how and go about it. You've got that all laid out for you, and you've got a plan laid out as to, we know what we want to measure, we know when we should measure it, we know how we should measure it. And so then the time issue sort of doesn't go away, but it gets mitigated quite a bit.
And that's been communicated to the leadership as well. So they're expecting that, right? So up front, you could tell them this is what we're going to have at the end of this. And so it's not over until that's been provided, right? So instead of being like, yeah, we're gonna do the training and then we're gonna do some things and assess it, and then they run out of, the attention spans change to other things. I think that's a really great comment, was that, yeah, the business has moved on. So we have to be clear up front about what we're trying to measure, and say, hey, this is what we're gonna get, and this is what we're gonna provide at the end of this. People will stick with you to the end at that point.
Yep.
But this is
And I think
this is not. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying I think the key takeaway from our data is that only 4% say we don't see a need. So on the one hand, we know that companies maybe aren't doing it a great deal, but it's not because they don't think they should.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out how do we get it done.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, so then we moved into who's helping determine the metrics. This goes back to our earlier data around being involved with the business and understanding. So I looked from our study, we asked what kind of relationship different roles in the organization have with setting learning metrics. And so I focused in here on business leaders, trying to see what kind of input they have. And you can see here, there's a slight gap between high performers and others around having no involvement, but it's still, I think in my mind, a little too high that even 26% of high performers say there's no involvement from business leaders in setting L&D metrics. Good to see that there's, the biggest group, they do provide input, and we see a pretty decent representation of having business leaders being the significant contributor to determining what the metrics are. But this gets into a lot of the questions that are coming in, and we'll talk about this stuff, Mike, as we go through this idea of connecting learning to these outcomes. And there's how do we there's no causation, so we can't measure that. But having this type of relationship, having business leaders involved in the process, gives you the information and the ammunition to make those connections stronger and clearer in the long run.
Yeah, and it makes it relevant. I mean, extremely relevant, right? It's like, well, this is what you identified as what you needed, and we're going to help you get there.
Yeah. This one always is interesting to me. It just, as far as challenges go, we asked companies, how accurate do you think the data is in other parts of the business? And now our respondent pool for Brandon Hall Group is clearly heavily weighted towards learning professionals. That's just the way it is. So not surprising that learning data came out at the top of the accuracy list, but the numbers are pretty small for companies that saying that things are either accurate or highly accurate. So you look at like learning, says they think 68% of learning professionals believe that the learning data is accurate or highly accurate, and then it just drops off precipitously as you move through the organization. And it blows my mind that 38% of the respondents think that their finance data is either accurate or highly accurate, and even core HR. And so if there isn't this faith in the data from around the organization, that can cause a problem. And so we have to get at, why do we believe that it's not accurate? Is it really the case that it's not accurate, or is it just a lack of understanding between departments? Yeah, this one highlights a pretty significant issue within most organizations.
Yeah, this is the first slide that I'm like, ugh, it's not super.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, it makes sense though.
Yeah, and then just to sort of tie it all up, going back to the outcomes, we looked at whether or not high performers were doing anything differently as far as using measurement outcomes to measure learning. And so we looked at companies that said they use these outcomes listed here consistently to measure learning. And granted, the numbers aren't huge, right? The highest one is only 28% saying that they use it consistently to measure their learning. But still, the gaps between high performers and others is pretty wide as you look through most of these. And so, again, not a causation, but more of a correlation, that high performers understand that in order to accurately measure learning's impact, you've got to use actual outcomes. All right, so the point of all this is just to try to think about it in these terms. And this model that I've got here sort of lays out the way that I've been talking about this, and talking about some of the questions and discussion that's been going on. So the idea is, if you can start at the beginning with these business outcomes, what is the business after? And in this model, these are just 4 very generic measurement pieces, outcomes that you can have. It could be anything that the organization is focused on, the things that they want to do. And then, okay, in order to do that, what are the things that people should be doing that we can train them or give them the skills or identify the behaviors that they should be exhibiting to impact those things? If we want revenue to grow, what are the things that people in the organization should be doing that help us grow revenue or increase profits or whatever it happens to be? So identify what those things are. And then, okay, what are things that we can do with learning? How can we take a training program or a learning program and influence those individual learning performances, right? So how do we get people to do things different? What knowledge do we need to give them? How do we show them the right way to do things? And once you've identified what those learning objectives are, Then it's about putting together the program in a way that matches the audience, the outcomes expected, the time frame in which we want those things to happen. And it could be any kind of a mix of learning types. Just, it doesn't matter. You don't have to follow 70-20-10 to the letter, if for those of you familiar with that framework. But the idea of having a mix of formal, informal, experiential learning at your disposal doesn't mean that every program has to have a mix of those things. It depends on what it calls for. And then the idea is then to sort of roll those out and implement those learning scenarios, and then you can measure back whether or not the learning objectives are being met. And if not, you can reconfigure how you're doing the learning, rethink the learning before waiting for the overall business performance outcome, right? That's far too long to wait. And again, it goes back to the whole idea of the business has moved on. It's about measuring the more immediate things first to see if you're on the right track. So the whole point of this, though, is the idea that, it says at the top there, learning is not the outcome, right? It isn't about learning, it's about behavior that drives performance. So obviously this model is in the deck for folks to take a look at. Mike, I think there's a lot of great discussion going on, so I want to dig into some of these questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I can't see them on my side, unfortunately. I was hoping I could see all the questions, but I don't see anything popping up. But that's okay. No worries. I'll let you drive that, and then we'll try to answer as much as we can.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw this one out to you. Here's a great one to start with. Why should organizations measure learning in the first place? Also, why does measuring success of learning make some organizations high-performance organizations? I'll take the second half of that.
Okay.
Measuring the success of learning doesn't make them high performers. What that data is showing is we have categorized a certain subset of our respondents as high-performing organizations based on their business KPIs. So that it's their performance on their key performance indicators that identifies them as high performers. We just then wanted to see if they do anything differently when it comes to learning measurement, and we highlighted those gaps in that data. So it's not the measurement of the learning itself that makes them high performers, it's that high performers are more likely to measure learning this way. So hopefully that clears that up for you. And then I love that first question, Mike, and I'll throw it to you. Why should organizations measure learning in the first place?
I'd say that we have a duty, fiduciary or otherwise, to grow the business. And you have to do that. In order to do that, you have to grow the people, and you have to keep those people around and keep them learning. I mean, people leave their businesses, they leave their jobs because they're bored, or they have issues with their managers, or a lot of different reasons. But one of the biggest is that they're bored, or they don't feel like they're growing. And maybe some of you can relate to this out there, or you've done this in the past, where you just felt like you're not getting anywhere. And again, the business needs to grow, which means the people need to grow. They need to be more competent, confident. Their capacity needs to be stretched. They need to continue to feel like something's happening in their lives, and that will help grow the business. So if we're not measuring that, and we're not adding learning as a big part of that, I feel like then you're just doing the job. You're showing up and you're doing the work, but you're working in the business, but not on the business, which I think is a big differentiator there, right? When you're thinking about it, it's not just I go in and I do this to this to this to this, and then I go home. It's I go in and I'm a critical part of this business to help it grow. And I feel like if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our jobs, because then the business isn't growing, and we have a big part of that as L&D professionals. And I take this very seriously, and I take it very much to heart that this piece of the business is one of the most critical things we can do to grow the business.
Yeah. And I've got a couple questions that are related, so I'll ask them together, and then we can talk about it. So in one, referring back to a lot of the data that we're showing, it says, talking about using those outcomes as a measurement of learning. Darren says, well, these often reflect correlation, though, not causation. Is there a way to directly tie L&D to these important outcomes? And then the other question is, how do you attribute the improvement of a KPI to the learning strategy? Because there are a lot of possible variables. And
That's
so, yeah, and it is true. No one's denying that there are a lot of variables involved in the business, as there should be. The business is made up of a whole mess of moving parts. It's a living, breathing organism kind of thing. But by saying that, I can't tell you that learning has had an impact on that outcome. Learning had nothing to do with employee engagement, or learning had nothing to do with revenue. By saying that, I can't say that. That's what you're abdicating. You're basically saying Right. Learning has had no impact. There are too many other variables. I can't demonstrate it, so we might as well just say that learning had no impact. The point of it is, by thinking through things this way, by starting with measurement at the beginning, right? By building learning, delivering learning with a measurement mindset, you're building up that case that says, yes, I can draw a line between that outcome and this learning, because that's what this learning was pointed at. We knew what we wanted to change. We know what it looked like before, because that's how we knew we needed to change it. So we've got our previous state. We can measure against our future state once we've done the training. And hey, maybe I'm a large organization and I can put different groups of people through the learning programs at different times. I can do some A/B testing between people who have had this training and people who haven't. Are the things that we want to be different? Are they different? And if so, how much? If not, why not? But what you're doing is you're giving yourself enough information, enough data that you can come to the table and say, yes, I understand that there are a lot of things at play. Our sales season is cyclical, or there was a downturn in the economy, whatever it may be. But you can say, but we are one of those variables as L&D. You can plant your flag in that, say, yes, there are many variables and we are one, and I can show you how. And I think that's the big key.
Yep. You can confidently state that. I completely agree, but nothing exists in the vacuum, right? So no matter what happens at the end of the day, it would be very difficult to show absolute causation unless you did it in a completely controlled environment, which businesses just aren't. And I mean, but I think what's enough though, right? Like what's good enough? Like where do you get to the point where, like you're saying, David, like I can plant my flag and say, I know we had a result, and here's how I can show that. It may not have been the only thing that contributed to that. However, it was a big piece of it, and we can really show that over time.
Yeah, I mean, let's take an example of a call center, and there's a goal to shorten call resolution time.
Yep.
Okay, so there's a training program involved that explains how do we get through this, how do we approach these calls and get to a point where they're resolved in a shorter amount of time. So there's an outcome, right, that you can measure by that says, okay, it was this long, we did the training, and for those people who took the training, it's now on average this long, so you can see if it worked or it didn't. Now that isn't just where it stops, right? Because now you're saying, okay, well, why does the organization want those call times to be shorter? What's the business impetus for that? Are you saving money? Are you improving customer satisfaction? Oh, okay, so it's a customer satisfaction issue. That's how learning is having that impact on customer satisfaction, because we've gotten us to a point where our call times are shorter, or we're resolving them on first call, or whatever it may be. And that's just one example. Now, clearly, some functions of the business are easier to measure than others. Things like call centers or sales performance. I mean, think of all the data you're already collecting around sales. But if there are sales training programs in place, that data is at your disposal now to say, look, we did this learning intervention at this point, and now this particular data point shifted or didn't shift when we wanted it to, but that's your result.
Right. And if you're a lot like me, just in closing, from my point of view, I'm like I'm more of a feelings kind of guy. I'm like, it's the right thing to do, and I'm excited. I want people to be excited about it, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the language that executives speak. They speak the numbers, They speak the money, they speak the show me the money type stuff. So I think, like for me, that's been a big challenge. If anyone can relate out there, that is to change the way that I communicate with the business. And I think this presentation today, it's exactly that way. So start with with that data in mind, and start with the ability to look into it and analyze it and understand what we're trying to measure, and then we're speaking that executive language, which gives us more ability to go in and ask for the things that we need and be more a part of the conversations, rather than they're going to be really good at this and they're going to be so much better. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And then the way you just described it in a second ago, David, was great. Like, well, here's the thing, we're going to reduce those times, and by reducing the times, here's how that works out to your advantage in speaking your language. So don't be afraid to shift the way that you speak to folks, and use their language to be able to get what you need.
Yeah, great point. Absolutely. Yeah, and I love it. You've always got a constant theme of the things that you think about and how you look at things, and I love this. A few times you've touched on this. Don't be afraid to ask for it, right?
Yeah.
What is it that you need? Go for it.
Yeah,
love
I think
that.
it's really important that people don't forget that nobody can read your mind. And I guess a lot of times this is like therapy for me because I think I'm just telling myself this, like over the course of my career, there have been a lot of times that I just haven't gone and stepped up and been proactive and said, this is what needs to happen. But if you do that, you'd be surprised how much further you get as long as you're speaking their language and your ability to showcase what it is that they're going to get as a value at the end of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to leave you with this easy softball here for you, Mike. Does SAP have a community page to discuss some of the starting points and lessons learned?
Yeah, well, SAP Litmos has one. If you go to support.litmos.com, there is there's one there. As we integrate more into SAP, we've been acquired for a couple of years now, but it takes a little while, right, to get into the mix. And I think, yeah, we're going to be creating more of those. If anybody wants to have any more conversations with me directly, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to do that and have conversations via there or wherever. But yeah, I mean, let's keep the conversations open. I'm your colleague. I'm a person that's also L&D. I consider myself a learning nerd, and I'm happy to have these conversations with folks and help your folks and to get better.
Awesome. Well, that's great to put out there, Mike. I appreciate
Yeah,
that. I'm sure everyone else does as well. I appreciate it as always getting an hour of your time to share talking about this stuff.
it's always
And
a
of
pleasure,
course,
David.
yeah, and thanks so much to SAP Litmos for giving us the hour to do this. It's been great and so many great questions and discussion. I love it. Thanks for all the interactivity, folks. We really appreciate it. And don't forget, you can download that PDF quickly here before we close the platform, and a link will also be emailed to you so you can download it and also get a link to the recording of the webinar if you would like. So thank you for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks for everything. Bye now.